The wife laughed during the reading, until the lawyer revealed what the millionaire and the janitor had planned. It's a moment frozen in time, sharp and cruel. How laughter can slice through a room full of silence, exposing a secret wound that no one saw coming. The kind of laugh born not from joy, but from scorn, disbelief mixed with entitlement. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're sweeping a long hallway, checking security cameras in some hidden corner, or locking the building for the night. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise you, today's story will shake your heart. This story begins in Chicago, where the wind carries more than just lake moisture. It carries the weight of dreams deferred and dignity tested. In the heart of the city's financial district, the Millennium Tower stretched 47 floors into the sky, its glass facade reflecting not just sunlight, but the ambitions and secrets of those who worked within its walls. The building housed law firms, investment companies, and private wealth management offices where millions of dollars in assets changed hands daily, where cryptocurrency transactions worth more than most people's lifetime earnings happened with the casual stroke of a pen. James Reynolds had been the building's head janitor for 17 years. Not the kind of maintenance worker who makes headlines or gets featured in corporate newsletters, but the kind whose presence was so constant, so reliable, that he had become invisible to those who mattered most. At 62, his shoulders carried the slight stoop of a man who had spent decades bending to clean what others left behind. His hands, weathered and scarred from industrial cleaners and rough surfaces, moved with the precision of someone who knew every corner, every crevice, every secret hiding place in the building. Every morning at 4:30, James arrived at the employee entrance on Lower Wacker Drive. The security guard, a young man named Marcus who had worked there for only 3 years, would nod respectfully, one of the few people who still acknowledged James's existence. The building at that hour was a cathedral of silence, the marble floors gleaming under fluorescent lights, the elevators waiting like sleeping giants. James would begin his ritual, checking the security monitors, emptying waste baskets from the upper floors, ensuring the executive washrooms were pristine before the first wave of suits arrived at 7. The irony wasn't lost on him that he knew more about the building's inhabitants than they could ever imagine. He had overheard phone calls about insider trading deals worth hundreds of thousands in profit. He had seen cryptocurrency wallet addresses scribbled on napkins and thrown away, representing fortunes in Bitcoin that most people couldn't comprehend. He had cleaned offices where stock market manipulations were planned over expensive whiskey, where inheritance disputes involving millions of dollars unfolded in heated whispers. James had become a living archive of the building's secrets, though no one suspected the quiet man with the mop bucket possessed such dangerous knowledge. Charles Saint, or Claire, occupied the penthouse office on the 47th floor. His wealth management firm controlled investment portfolios worth over $2 billion, with clients ranging from tech entrepreneurs to old money families whose assets included everything from Manhattan real estate to gold reserves stored in Swiss banks. Charles himself was worth approximately $50 million, his net worth built on a combination of smart investments, strategic partnerships, and what he liked to call creative financial engineering. His wife, Elaine, spent her days managing their social calendar and their substantial stock portfolio, though she preferred shopping on Michigan Avenue to analyzing dividend yields. James had watched Charles for years, had seen him during his private moments when the office was empty except for the cleaning crew. He had observed the man's mounting stress as federal investigators began circling his firm like vultures, drawn by whispers of securities fraud and money laundering. James had seen Charles burning documents in the executive bathroom's fireplace, had watched him transfer large sums into offshore cryptocurrency accounts, had even found USB drives containing encrypted files thrown carelessly into wastebaskets. The penthouse office was Charles's fortress, decorated with Persian rugs worth more than James's annual salary. Walls lined with first-edition books and original paintings by artists whose names appeared regularly at Sotheby's auctions. The office's crown jewel was Elaine's grandmother's diamond necklace, displayed in a custom-made glass case, a family heirloom appraised at over $300,000, its insurance policy alone costing more than what James made in 3 years. The necklace was more than jewelry. It was a symbol of generational wealth, of blood bluer than Lake Michigan in winter. But James saw what others missed. He noticed how Charles's hands shook when he thought no one was looking, how he had started working later into the night, how his phone calls had become increasingly desperate. He heard the fragments of conversations about frozen assets, about federal subpoenas, about the need to liquidate investments quickly before the walls closed in completely. James understood that Charles's empire, built on a foundation of leveraged buyouts and questionable financial instruments, was beginning to crumble like sandcastles before an incoming tide. The relationship between James and the building's elite residents was one of profound inequality, marked by the kind of casual dismissal that wealth often shows toward those who serve it. Elaine St. Clair was particularly cruel, treating James as if he were part of the building's fixtures rather than a human being. She would walk past him while talking loudly on her phone about stock options and capital gains, never acknowledging his presence even when he held elevator doors open for her. She complained about him to building management whenever she found even the smallest imperfection, as if his mere existence was an affront to her refined sensibilities. The other residents followed her lead. Emily Watson, an ambitious junior partner at one of the law firms, would roll her eyes whenever James appeared in her peripheral vision, as if his uniform and cleaning cart were visual pollution in her perfectly curated world. Dr. Helen Morrison, whose practice specialized in cosmetic procedures for Chicago's elite, would literally step around James as if he were an obstacle, never making eye contact, never offering even the courtesy of basic human acknowledgement. But James endured it all with quiet dignity, understanding that their cruelty revealed more about them than it did about him. He had learned long ago that some people's need to feel superior required others to feel small, that wealth without wisdom often produced arrogance without empathy. He continued his work, continued his observations, continued building his invisible archive of their secrets, though he never imagined how valuable that information would eventually become. The morning of March 15th started like any other, with James arriving before dawn to begin his systematic cleaning of the upper floors. The building's heating system hummed its familiar tune, and the elevator cables sang their mechanical lullabies as early arrivals began trickling in around 6:30. James was on the 45th floor, methodically emptying wastebaskets and wiping down surfaces, when he heard the first commotion echoing up from the penthouse level. By 8 o'clock, police officers were stationed throughout the building, their radios crackling with official codes and procedural language. The rumor spread like wildfire through the offices. Elaine St. Clair's diamond necklace had vanished from its supposedly secure display case. The family heirloom, insured for $300,000 but worth far more in sentimental value, had disappeared without a trace. The glass case showed no signs of forced entry. The security system had recorded no unusual activity, and the penthouse office had been locked all night. James learned about the theft not from any official announcement, but from overhearing conversations as he continued his rounds. He listened to security guards comparing notes, to police officers reviewing surveillance footage, to Charles St. Clair himself frantically making phone calls to insurance companies and private investigators. The investigation began immediately, with detectives interviewing everyone who had access to the penthouse level. When they questioned James, their tone was already accusatory. Detective Morrison, a heavy-set man with tired eyes who seemed to have already decided James's guilt, asked pointed questions about his whereabouts, his financial situation, his knowledge of the building's security systems. James answered honestly, explaining that he had been on the 45th floor all morning, that several people could verify his presence there, that he had never even touched the glass case containing the necklace. But honesty meant little in the face of prejudice and assumption. Within hours, whispers began circulating through the building that the janitor, The man who had access to every office, every room, every secret space, must be responsible. After all, who else could have committed such a perfect inside job? Who else would have both the opportunity and the desperation to steal something so valuable? The logic was circular and cruel. James was poor, therefore he was desperate. He was desperate, therefore he was guilty. Elaine St. Clair led the charge against him, her voice rising with indignation as she spoke to anyone who would listen. "It has to be him," she declared to a group of residents gathered in the main lobby. "Who else has been creeping around our offices, listening to our conversations, watching our every move? I've always felt uncomfortable with that man lurking about. There's something shifty about him, something untrustworthy." Her voice carried the authority of inherited wealth and social position, the kind of voice that people listen to not because of wisdom, but because of power. The accusation gained momentum despite the complete lack of evidence. Charles St. Clair, desperate to direct attention away from his own mounting legal troubles, agreed with his wife's assessment. "We've been too trusting," he said during a hastily organized building meeting. "We've allowed someone with questionable character to have access to our most private spaces. This is what happens when we ignore the obvious security risks right under our noses." James felt the walls closing in around him as resident after resident nodded in agreement. Emily Watson spoke up to say she had always found James suspicious, though she couldn't articulate why. Dr. Morrison mentioned that her office had been disturbed recently, though nothing had been missing. The narrative was building itself, fueled by class prejudice and the need for a convenient scapegoat. The building management company, terrified of liability and eager to appease their wealthy tenants, called James into a meeting that afternoon. The property manager, a nervous man named Kenneth Bailey, who had never shown James any particular kindness, delivered the news with bureaucratic coldness. James was being suspended immediately pending the outcome of the police investigation. His building access was revoked, his keys confiscated, his 17 years of faithful service dismissed as if they had never mattered. "I'm sorry, James," Bailey said, though his tone suggested anything but regret. "We have to protect the interests of our residents. Until this matter is resolved, we can't allow you to continue working here." "I'm sure you understand." But James understood far more than Bailey realized. He understood that he was being sacrificed to protect people who had never seen him as fully human, that his years of loyalty meant nothing when measured against the complaints of those who paid premium rent for their premium prejudices. As James cleaned out his small maintenance office in the building's basement, packing 17 years of his life into a cardboard box, he felt the weight of injustice settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. But alongside the pain and humiliation, something else was stirring. A quiet resolve, a determination to prove his innocence not through words, but through truth. He had spent years observing, listening, remembering. Perhaps it was time to put that knowledge to use. Before leaving the building for what everyone assumed would be the last time, James made one final stop. Using the master key he was supposed to surrender but had forgotten to remove from his personal keychain, he visited Charles St. Clair's penthouse office one last time. Not to steal anything, but to retrieve something that belonged to him, a small digital recorder he had hidden months earlier when he first began documenting the conversations he overheard during his late-night cleaning sessions. The recorder had captured dozens of hours of audio. Phone calls about securities violations, discussions of money laundering through cryptocurrency exchanges, plans to hide assets in offshore accounts before federal investigators could freeze them. James had initially started recording as protection against false accusations. He had seen too many working-class people destroyed by the powerful's ability to shift blame downward. He never imagined the recordings would contain evidence of crimes far more serious than his supposed theft of a diamond necklace. As he slipped the tiny device into his pocket, James also noticed something else, a crumpled letter in Charles's wastebasket, partially burned but still legible. It was correspondence from a federal prosecutor, outlining the government's case against Charles's firm and mentioning specific evidence of securities fraud involving over $12 million in illegal profits. The letter made it clear that Charles was days away from being arrested, that his assets were about to be frozen, that his carefully constructed empire of wealth and influence was about to collapse. James understood then why the necklace had disappeared, why he had been so quickly and eagerly blamed. Charles needed a distraction from his legal troubles, needed a story that would make him appear to be a victim rather than a perpetrator. The theft of his wife's family heirloom, conveniently blamed on a poor janitor with no social standing to defend himself, was the perfect narrative to shift public attention away from federal securities charges. Walking out of the Millennium Tower on that cold March evening, James felt a strange mixture of sadness and clarity. He had lost his job, his reputation, his sense of belonging to a community that had never truly accepted him. But he had also gained something valuable, the knowledge that truth, however buried, has a way of surfacing when the time is right. He just had to be patient enough to wait for that time to come. The months that followed James's dismissal were marked by a humiliation that seemed to seep into every aspect of his life. The story of the janitor accused of stealing a millionaire's jewels spread through Chicago's service worker community like a virus, carrying with it the implication that James Reynolds was not to be trusted, that his 17 years of faithful service had been a long con, that his quiet dignity had been a mask hiding criminal intentions. Finding new employment proved nearly impossible. Security companies rejected his applications the moment they ran background checks and discovered the pending investigation. Building management firms, all of which seemed to know each other in the incestuous world of Chicago real estate, passed word that James was problematic and unreliable. Even positions that should have been far removed from his supposed crime, dishwashing at restaurants, stock work at warehouses, somehow became unavailable once his name was mentioned. James survived on his modest savings, accumulated over years of living simply and spending little on himself. His apartment on the South Side, a one-bedroom walk-up that he had called home for over a decade, became both his refuge and his prison. He spent long days sitting by the window, watching the city continue its relentless pace while he remained frozen in time, suspended between accusation and resolution. The isolation was perhaps more painful than the financial hardship. James had never been a particularly social person, but he had found community in his work, had exchanged pleasantries with Marcus the security guard, had shared occasional conversations with Helen, the cleaning lady who worked the evening shift. Now those connections were severed, replaced by suspicious glances and whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when he appeared. But James was not idle during those months of exile. He spent hours each day listening to the recordings he had collected, transcribing conversations, researching the names and companies mentioned in Charles St. Clair's private phone calls. What he discovered was a web of financial crimes that made the theft of a diamond necklace seem trivial by comparison. The recordings revealed that Charles's wealth management firm had been engaged in a complex securities fraud scheme for over 3 years. They had been selling unregistered investment products to elderly clients, promising guaranteed returns backed by revolutionary cryptocurrency algorithms that existed only on paper. The firm had raised over $40 million from retirees seeking safe investments for their life savings, money that had been diverted into Charles's personal accounts and spent on luxury real estate, expensive art, and high-risk stock market speculation. James learned that the federal investigation was more advanced than anyone realized. The FBI had been building a case for 18 months, collecting evidence from multiple sources, preparing to make arrests that would implicate not just Charles, but several other prominent figures in Chicago's financial community. The theft of Elaine's necklace, James realized, was a desperate attempt to create a narrative of victimhood just as the federal hammer was about to fall. As winter turned to spring, James began reaching out to lawyers, though most were reluctant to take on a case involving accusations against such prominent citizens. The few who agreed to meet with him were skeptical of his claims, dismissive of his evidence, unwilling to believe that a janitor could possess information that had eluded trained investigators. One attorney actually laughed when James mentioned the recordings, suggesting that perhaps he should focus on finding a new job rather than pursuing conspiracy theories. But James persisted, driven by something deeper than a desire for personal vindication. He had spent 17 years watching powerful people treat working-class individuals as disposable, had seen too many good people destroyed by the casual cruelty of those who believed wealth granted them immunity from consequences. This was bigger than his own situation. This was about justice for everyone who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or scapegoated by those who confused money with moral authority. Meanwhile, the investigation into the necklace theft continued to stagnate. Despite extensive searches, interviews, and forensic analysis, police had found no physical evidence linking James to the crime. The security footage showed nothing suspicious. The insurance investigation revealed no signs of professional theft techniques, and James's financial records showed no indication of sudden wealth or unusual purchases. Privately, Detective Morrison was beginning to have doubts about the case. The evidence against James was entirely circumstantial, based on assumption rather than fact. But the pressure from Charles St. Clair and building management was intense, and Morrison's superiors wanted the case closed quickly to avoid embarrassing questions about the investigation's competence. As James struggled with unemployment and social isolation, cracks were beginning to appear in Charles St. Clair's carefully constructed facade. The federal investigation was accelerating, with FBI agents conducting interviews with former employees and examining financial records going back 5 years. Charles's attempts to liquidate assets and transfer money to offshore accounts had been detected and frozen by federal prosecutors. His investment firm's clients were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about missing dividend payments and delayed withdrawals. The stress was taking a visible toll on both Charles and Elaine. Neighbors reported seeing lights on in the penthouse office at all hours of the night, hearing raised voices and the sound of papers being shredded. Elaine's shopping expeditions on Michigan Avenue became less frequent, her usual arrogance replaced by a nervous energy that suggested she understood how precarious their situation had become. But they continued to maintain the fiction that James Reynolds was the real criminal in their story, the dangerous outsider who had violated their trust and stolen their precious family heirloom. The narrative had become so central to their identity as victims that they couldn't abandon it without admitting they had destroyed an innocent man's life for their own convenience. James, however, was no longer the same man who had quietly accepted injustice for 17 years. The months of suffering had refined his understanding of power and truth, had taught him that dignity without action was merely nobility in defeat. He had learned to navigate legal databases, to understand financial records, to piece together evidence like a detective building a case. Most importantly, he had learned that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is patience combined with preparation. Spring gave way to summer, and still the case remained officially open but practically abandoned. But James knew something that law enforcement didn't. The truth has its own timeline, and sometimes justice delayed is not justice denied, but justice perfected. He continued his meticulous documentation, his careful research, his patient construction of a case that would eventually shake the foundation of everything Charles St. Clair had built. The beginning of the end came on a sweltering July morning when FBI agents arrested Charles St. Clair at his home, charging him with securities fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to defraud investors. The arrest warrant detailed a scheme that had defrauded elderly clients of over $40 million. Money that had been funneled through a maze of shell companies and cryptocurrency exchanges before landing in Charles's personal investment accounts. The local news coverage was extensive, with reporters camping outside the Millennium Tower and interviewing shocked residents who claimed they never suspected that their neighbor was capable of such crimes. The story had all the elements that capture public attention. A wealthy financier brought low, elderly victims robbed of their life savings, exotic financial instruments that most people didn't understand but instinctively distrusted. But James Reynolds was watching the coverage from his small apartment with mixed feelings. While he felt vindicated by Charles's arrest, it confirmed what he had discovered during his months of investigation. The charges had nothing to do with the diamond necklace or his own wrongful accusation. He remained suspended from his job, his reputation still tarnished by allegations that had never been proved but had never been formally dismissed. The federal case against Charles moved quickly through the court system. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the testimony of cooperating witnesses, Charles's lawyers advised him to negotiate a plea agreement rather than risk a trial that could result in a 30-year prison sentence. The government was willing to accept a guilty plea to reduce charges in exchange for Charles's cooperation in identifying other participants in the fraud scheme and providing information about assets that could be recovered for victim restitution. It was during these plea negotiations that an interesting detail emerged. Charles's lawyer, in an attempt to demonstrate his client's cooperation and remorse, mentioned that Charles had information about other crimes, including the theft of valuable artwork and jewelry from wealthy Chicago residents. The federal prosecutor, intrigued by this potential lead, asked for more specific information. What Charles revealed was a confession that he had orchestrated the disappearance of his wife's diamond necklace as a desperate attempt to create a distraction from his mounting legal troubles. He had hired a professional thief to steal the necklace, then had it moved to a safety deposit box in the Cayman Islands where it could be sold to private collectors once the investigation died down. The plan had been to blame the theft on someone expendable, someone whose word would never be trusted over that of a millionaire. James Reynolds, Charles explained to federal prosecutors, had been the perfect scapegoat. A janitor with no social connections, no powerful friends, no platform from which to defend himself. Charles had counted on the natural prejudice that wealthy people harbor toward service workers, the assumption that poverty breeds desperation and desperation breeds criminality. He had manipulated the narrative expertly, turning himself from perpetrator into victim, from criminal into grieving husband whose family's precious heirloom had been stolen by someone he had trusted. The confession was devastating in its casual cruelty. Charles showed no remorse for destroying James's life, no awareness that his scapegoating had caused real human suffering. To him, James had been a convenient prop in a desperate performance, an expendable extra in the drama of his own survival. The confession revealed not just criminal behavior, but a moral bankruptcy that was perhaps more damaging than the securities fraud itself. Federal prosecutors immediately contacted Chicago police about Charles's confession regarding the necklace theft. Detective Morrison, who had harbored private doubts about James's guilt for months, felt a mixture of relief and shame as he read the federal prosecutor's report. Relief that the truth had finally emerged, shame that he had participated in the persecution of an innocent man based on nothing more than class prejudice and convenient assumptions. The wheels of bureaucracy moved slowly, but they moved. James Reynolds was officially cleared of all suspicion in the necklace theft, and the charges were formally dropped. The building management company, terrified of potential lawsuits and bad publicity, offered to reinstate James immediately with full back pay and a formal apology. But James was no longer interested in simply returning to his old life. The months of struggle and investigation had changed him, had revealed capabilities and strengths he hadn't known he possessed. He had learned to research legal documents, to analyze financial records, to understand the complex web of relationships that connected Chicago's wealthy elite. More importantly, he had learned that his years of silent observation had value, that his knowledge of the building's secrets could be put to use in ways he had never imagined. Instead of accepting reinstatement as a janitor, James approached the federal prosecutors with a proposal. He had recordings and documentation that could help them understand the full scope of financial crimes being committed in Chicago's office buildings. He had witnessed conversations and observed behaviors that could lead to additional investigations and prosecutions. He offered to serve as a consultant to law enforcement, using his unique position and extensive knowledge to help protect other working-class people from being victimized by the wealthy and powerful. The prosecutors were initially skeptical, but as they reviewed James's evidence and listened to his recordings, they realized that he possessed a treasure trove of information about white-collar crime in Chicago's financial district. His 17 years of invisible presence in the Millennium Tower had given him access to secrets that even trained investigators would struggle to uncover. A new arrangement was worked out. James would be employed as a civilian consultant to a joint federal task force investigating financial crimes. His job would be to use his experience and knowledge to help identify patterns of suspicious behavior, to suggest areas for investigation, to provide context and background that only someone with his unique perspective could offer. The transformation was remarkable. James Reynolds, who had been dismissed as an expendable janitor, had become a valuable asset to law enforcement. His patient observation, his meticulous memory, his deep understanding of how wealthy people behaved when they thought no one was watching. All of these qualities that had made him invisible in his previous life made him indispensable in his new role. But the most satisfying moment came during Charles St. Clair's sentencing hearing. As part of the court proceedings, Charles was required to make a formal apology to the victims of his crimes. The judge insisted that this include an acknowledgement of his false accusation against James Reynolds, a public admission that he had attempted to destroy an innocent man's life to save his own. Standing before a packed courtroom, Charles read a prepared statement that his lawyers had carefully crafted. I deeply regret the harm I caused to Mr. James Reynolds by falsely accusing him of theft. Mr. Reynolds is a man of integrity who served faithfully for 17 years, and I attempted to make him a scapegoat for my own criminal behavior. I take full responsibility for the damage I caused to his reputation and livelihood. James sat in the gallery, wearing his best suit, the same suit he had worn to job interviews during his months of unemployment. As he listened to Charles's apology, he felt not triumph but a quiet satisfaction, the sense that justice had finally been served not through revenge, but through truth. The man who had dismissed him as unworthy of notice was now publicly acknowledging his worth before a courtroom full of people. Elaine St. Clair, whose cruel laughter had started this entire ordeal, sat beside her husband with tears streaming down her face. The federal investigation had revealed that she had been an active participant in the securities fraud, helping to recruit victims from her social circle and using her position in Chicago society to lend credibility to her husband's investment schemes. She would face her own criminal charges, her own reckoning with the consequences of treating other human beings as disposable. After the hearing, James walked out of the federal courthouse into the Chicago sunshine, feeling lighter than he had in months. He had lost a job but found a career. He had lost his invisibility but gained his voice. He had lost his place in a building but found his place in a larger fight for justice. The work James did with the federal task force over the next 2 years led to 17 additional arrests and the recovery of over $60 million in stolen assets. His ability to recognize patterns of behavior, to interpret conversations and documents that others might dismiss, to understand the culture and mindset of Chicago's financial elite proved invaluable to investigators who had been trained to catch criminals, but not necessarily to understand them. His consulting work also led to changes in how federal law enforcement approached white-collar crime investigations. James's insights about the lives and routines of service workers, their access to information, their invisibility to the wealthy, their potential value as sources and witnesses, resulted in new training programs that taught investigators how to identify and cultivate relationships with the people who saw everything but were rarely asked what they had observed. But perhaps the most significant change was in James himself. The quiet, deferential janitor who had accepted injustice as inevitable, had been transformed into a confident professional who understood his own worth and insisted that others recognize it as well. He had learned that dignity wasn't something that could be granted or taken away by others. It was something that came from within, from knowing that you had acted with integrity even when no one was watching. 3 years after his wrongful accusation, James received an unexpected visitor at his new office in the federal building downtown. Marcus, the young security guard who had always treated him with respect, had come to thank him for the example he had set. Marcus had testified in several of the cases that grew out of James's initial investigation, had helped prosecutors understand the security systems and access patterns that had enabled the financial crimes to continue undetected. "You showed me that paying attention matters," Marcus told James, "that even if people don't think you're important, what you see and remember can make a difference. I'm going back to school to study criminal justice. I want to do what you're doing, help catch the people who think they're untouchable." James felt a deep satisfaction hearing Marcus's words. The young man represented something that hadn't existed before, a network of observant, thoughtful people in service positions who understood that their work had value beyond just keeping buildings clean and secure. They were the eyes and ears of justice, the unseen guardians who could protect their communities from those who would exploit and harm them. As years passed, James's reputation grew within law enforcement circles. He was invited to speak at conferences about white-collar crime, to train investigators about the culture of wealth and power, to consult on cases involving financial fraud and corruption. His story became a case study in criminology programs, an example of how the right person in the right place at the right time could make an enormous difference in the fight against crime. But James never forgot his roots or the community he had come from. He established a foundation to provide legal aid and support services to working-class people who had been wrongfully accused of crimes or abused by their employers. The foundation operated on the principle that everyone deserves dignity and justice, regardless of their social position or economic status. The Millennium Tower, meanwhile, underwent significant changes. The building management company, chastened by the scandal and the legal liability they had narrowly avoided, implemented new policies regarding employee treatment and tenant complaints. They established an ombudsman program to ensure that accusations against service workers would be thoroughly investigated before any disciplinary action was taken. Elaine St. Clair, after serving 18 months in federal prison, attempted to rebuild her life in Chicago. But her role in the securities fraud and her cruel treatment of James Reynolds had made her a pariah in the social circles she had once dominated. She eventually moved to Florida, where she lived quietly on the modest amount of money that hadn't been seized by federal prosecutors. Charles St. Clair served 4 years in federal prison before being released to a halfway house in Milwaukee. His assets had been liquidated to pay restitution to the victims of his fraud, leaving him with virtually nothing except the knowledge of how far he had fallen and how much damage he had caused. He never attempted to contact James Reynolds or to make any personal apology beyond what the court had required. The diamond necklace was eventually recovered from the Cayman Islands safety deposit box and returned to rightful ownership, though by then it had become more of a symbol than a treasured family heirloom. The insurance company donated it to a museum, where it was displayed alongside information about the case and the lessons it taught about justice, dignity, and the power of truth. James Reynolds continued his work with federal law enforcement for several more years before eventually retiring to write a book about his experiences. The book, titled The Invisible Witness, became a bestseller and was adapted into a documentary film that won several awards for its portrayal of working-class heroism and the importance of paying attention to those whom society overlooks. On quiet evenings in his comfortable apartment, one very different from the cramped walk-up he had lived in during his months of unemployment, James would sometimes think about the moment when Elaine St. Clair's laughter had filled that lawyer's office, so confident and cruel. He would remember how that laughter had changed to tears, how the tables had turned so completely that the accusers became the accused, the powerful became the powerless. But he took no pleasure in their downfall. What satisfied him was not their punishment, but the knowledge that justice had been served, that truth had prevailed over deception, that the system had eventually worked for someone like him rather than against him. He had learned that dignity doesn't come from others' recognition, but from knowing you have acted with integrity. That power doesn't come from wealth, but from standing up for what's right. That visibility doesn't come from status, but from having something important to say and the courage to say it. James's story became part of Chicago's folklore, told and retold in communities throughout the city where people worked hard for modest wages and sometimes wondered if anyone noticed their contributions or cared about their struggles. His example showed them that one person's integrity and persistence could make a difference, that truth has its own power, that justice might be delayed but need not be denied. In the end, James Reynolds had gained something more valuable than revenge or recognition. He had proven to himself and to the world that every person has worth, that every voice deserves to be heard, that every worker who shows up faithfully day after day is contributing something essential to the functioning of society. He had transformed from invisible to indispensable, from ignored to influential, from dismissed to dignified. The building where he had once pushed a mop still stood in Chicago's financial district, still gleaming with marble and glass, still humming with the sound of money being made and lost. But it was a different place now, one where people paid attention to those who served them, where respect was shown to everyone regardless of their position, where the lessons learned from James Reynolds' story continued to echo in the daily interactions between the powerful and those who worked in their shadows. And somewhere in that building, perhaps in a modest office or a maintenance closet, another pair of eyes was watching, another mind was listening, another person was faithfully doing their job while quietly observing the world around them. Because James Reynolds had shown that you never know who's paying attention, who's remembering what they see and hear, who might one day step forward when truth needs a witness and justice needs a voice. But the ripple effects of James's story continued to spread far beyond the confines of Chicago's financial district. The James Reynolds Foundation, which he had established with part of the proceeds from his book sales and consulting work, began to take on cases across the Midwest. The foundation's lawyers, many of them young attorneys inspired by James's example, worked pro bono to defend service workers, security guards, custodians, and maintenance staff who had been wrongfully accused or mistreated by their employers. One of the first major cases the foundation handled involved Maria Santos, a hospital cleaning woman in Detroit who had been accused of stealing prescription drugs from patient rooms. Like James, Maria had been immediately suspended based on nothing more than suspicion and the word of wealthy patients who claimed their personal medications had gone missing. The hospital administration, eager to avoid conflict with their affluent clientele, had been prepared to terminate Maria and potentially file criminal charges. But the James Reynolds Foundation investigators discovered what hospital security had missed. The actual thief was a night shift nurse with a drug addiction who had been systematically stealing medications for months. Maria's only crime had been being in the wrong place at the wrong time, wearing the wrong uniform, speaking with the wrong accent. The foundation not only cleared Maria's name, but secured a substantial settlement that allowed her to pursue nursing school, a dream she had harbored for years but could never afford. The foundation's work attracted national attention, and James found himself testifying before congressional committees about the systematic mistreatment of working-class employees in corporate America. He spoke eloquently about the double standard that allowed wealthy individuals to make accusations without evidence while presuming guilt on the part of those who couldn't afford high-powered lawyers to defend themselves. "We live in a society that treats poverty as a character flaw," James told one Senate subcommittee. When someone wealthy loses something, we immediately look to blame the person who cleans their office, serves their coffee, or parks their car. We assume that desperation makes people dishonest, but in my experience, it's power and privilege that corrupt character. The poor can't afford to be dishonest. One mistake costs them everything. It's the wealthy who gamble with other people's money, who bend rules because they believe the rules don't apply to them. His testimony was carried live on C-SPAN and later excerpted in newspapers across the country. The footage went viral on social media, with millions of viewers sharing clips of the former janitor speaking truth to power with quiet dignity and undeniable authority. Comments poured in from service workers across America who recognized their own experiences in James's words, who felt seen and heard perhaps for the first time in their working lives. The political impact was immediate and significant. Within 6 months, Congress passed the Worker Protection Act, legislation that required employers to conduct thorough investigations before terminating employees accused of theft or misconduct. The law also established penalties for companies that failed to follow due process procedures when dealing with workplace accusations, and it created a federal ombudsman office to investigate claims of employee mistreatment. But James's influence extended beyond the realm of legislation and legal reform. His story inspired a new generation of investigative journalists who began paying attention to the experiences of working-class Americans in ways that had been neglected by mainstream media. Reporters started spending time with janitors, security guards, food service workers, and maintenance staff, discovering a wealth of untold stories about dignity, resilience, and quiet heroism in the face of systematic indifference. One such journalist, Sarah Mitchell of The Washington Post, spent 6 months embedded with cleaning crews in office buildings throughout the D.C. metropolitan area. Her resulting series, The Invisible Workforce, revealed widespread wage theft, unsafe working conditions, and systematic mistreatment of service workers in some of the nation's most prestigious buildings. The series won a Pulitzer Prize and led to federal investigations that recovered millions of dollars in unpaid wages. James Reynolds taught us to see the people we had been trained to overlook, Mitchell said in her acceptance speech for the Pulitzer. He showed us that those who clean our offices, guard our buildings, and serve our food are not just part of the scenery. They're human beings with stories worth telling, insights worth hearing, and dignity worth defending. The cultural shift was perhaps even more significant than the legal and political changes. James's story became required reading in business schools, where future executives learned about the importance of treating all employees with respect and the dangers of creating workplace cultures that devalued certain types of work. Human resources professionals began implementing new training programs focused on unconscious bias and the importance of fair investigation procedures. Even in Chicago's financial district, where James's ordeal had begun, the changes were visible. The Millennium Tower had become a model for ethical employee treatment, with regular training sessions on respect and dignity in the workplace. Building management had implemented an anonymous reporting system that allowed workers to raise concerns without fear of retaliation, and they had established a worker advocate position to ensure that all employees were treated fairly. The new head janitor at the Millennium Tower was a woman named Patricia Williams, a 45-year-old single mother who had been inspired by James's story to pursue additional education in building management and security systems. Unlike James, who had worked in relative invisibility, Patricia was treated as a valued member of the building's management team, consulted on security improvements, and included in discussions about building operations. Mr. Reynolds changed everything for people like me, Patricia explained to a reporter who was writing a follow-up story on the anniversary of the necklace scandal. I don't have to be invisible anymore. The tenants know my name, they respect my expertise, and they understand that I'm not just here to clean up their messes. I'm here to keep this building running safely and efficiently. That's a big change from how things used to be. The transformation extended to individual relationships as well. Emily Watson, The junior partner who had once rolled her eyes at James's presence had become an advocate for worker rights within her law firm. She had pushed successfully for the creation of a pro bono program that provided legal services to service workers facing employment disputes, and she regularly volunteered her time with the James Reynolds Foundation. "I was part of the problem," Watson admitted during a panel discussion about workplace culture and class bias. "I saw James every day for years, but I never really saw him as a person. I was so wrapped up in my own ambitions, my own sense of importance, that I forgot that everyone deserves basic human decency." James's story forced me to confront my own prejudices and to ask myself what kind of person I wanted to be. Dr. Helen Morrison, the cosmetic surgeon who had literally stepped around James as if he were an obstacle, had undergone her own transformation. She had established a charitable foundation that provided free medical services to service workers and their families, and she had become a vocal advocate for health care reform that would ensure all working people had access to quality medical care, regardless of their employment status. "My mother cleaned offices for 30 years, Dr. Morrison revealed during a medical conference presentation about healthcare equity. She raised 5 children on a cleaning woman's salary, worked double shifts to pay for my medical school education, and never complained about the people who treated her as if she didn't matter." When I heard James Reynolds' story, I realized I had become exactly the kind of person who had made my mother's life harder. I had forgotten where I came from and what real dignity looked like. The changes weren't limited to those who had directly wronged James. Across Chicago and throughout the country, his story had sparked conversations about class, dignity, and the value of all honest work. University students organized forums on economic inequality and worker rights. Religious congregations discussed the moral obligations that come with economic privilege. Community groups launched initiatives to connect middle-class professionals with service workers in their buildings and neighborhoods, fostering relationships that crossed traditional class boundaries. One of the most moving developments was the emergence of what came to be known as Reynolds Circles, informal groups of service workers who met regularly to share their experiences, support each other through workplace challenges, and advocate collectively for better treatment. These groups formed in cities across America, creating networks of mutual aid and solidarity among people who had previously worked in isolation. The first Reynolds Circle had formed in Chicago, started by Marcus, the security guard who had testified in the federal cases growing out of James's investigation. The group met monthly in a South Side community center, bringing together janitors, security guards, food service workers, parking attendants, and maintenance staff from buildings throughout the financial district. "Before Mr. Reynolds, we all worked alone," Marcus explained to a documentary filmmaker who was creating a follow-up film about the lasting impact of James's story. "We might see each other in the hallways or the elevators, but we didn't know each other's names, didn't share our stories, didn't support each other when times got tough. Now, we're a community. We look out for each other. We share information about good employers and bad ones, and we make sure nobody goes through what Mr. Reynolds went through, not alone anyway." The Reynolds Circles had become a national movement with chapters in over 200 cities. They provided not just emotional support, but practical assistance, legal aid referrals, job placement networks, educational opportunities, and advocacy training. Many members had gone on to pursue additional education, start their own businesses, or become advocates and organizers in their communities. James himself remained humble about his role in inspiring these changes. When asked about his legacy during interviews, he would typically redirect attention to the ongoing work of the foundation and the continued need for workplace justice reform. But privately, he was deeply moved by the knowledge that his ordeal had helped improve conditions for countless other working people. "I never wanted to be famous," he confided to his foundation's executive director during one of their regular strategy meetings. "I just wanted to clear my name and maybe help a few other people avoid what I went through. But if my story has given voice to people who felt voiceless, if it's helped create a more just workplace for the next generation, then maybe everything I suffered was worth it." The 5-year anniversary of the necklace scandal was marked by a special conference in Chicago, bringing together labor advocates, legal professionals, academics, and service workers from across the country. The conference, titled Dignity at Work: The James Reynolds Legacy, featured presentations on everything from workplace investigation procedures to the psychology of class bias to the economics of service work. James was the keynote speaker, addressing an audience of over 1,000 people in a convention center ballroom. He took the stage wearing the same suit he had worn to Charles St. Clair's sentencing hearing, not out of lack of options, but as a symbolic reminder of how far he and the movement he had inspired had come. 5 years ago, I was a man without a voice, without a name worth remembering, without a story anyone thought was worth telling, James began. Today, I stand before you not as a victim, but as a witness to the power of truth, the importance of dignity, and the possibility of change. Every person in this room, whether you clean offices or argue cases, whether you guard buildings or manage foundations, whether you serve food or teach students, every person here has value that cannot be measured in dollars or status or square footage of office space. He paused, looking out over the diverse audience that included former colleagues from the Millennium Tower, federal prosecutors who had worked on the St. Clair case, service workers from across the country, and activists who had been inspired by his example. The laughter that started this story, that cruel, dismissive laughter that said some people matter more than others, that laughter has been replaced by something more powerful. The sound of voices that refuse to be silenced, the voices of people who know their worth and demand that others recognize it too. That's the real legacy here. Not one man's vindication, but a movement of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, insisting on dignity, fighting for justice, proving every day that there's no such thing as unimportant work or disposable workers. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes, but James felt most moved by the sight of service workers in the audience, men and women wearing name tags from hotels, hospitals, office buildings, and schools throughout the Midwest, standing and applauding not just for him but for themselves, for their own worth and dignity and the bright future they were building together. The laughter that had begun this story had long since faded, replaced by something more valuable. The quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing you have lived with integrity, served with dignity, and left the world a little more just than you found it. That is James Reynolds's true legacy. Not the crimes he helped solve or the criminals he helped catch, but the example he set for anyone who has ever felt invisible, ignored, or underestimated. And you, have you ever felt invisible while you were the one holding everything together? Have you ever been dismissed by people who should have known better, blamed for things you didn't do, treated as if your years of faithful service meant nothing? Tell me your story in the comments below. I want to hear about the moments when you stood up for yourself, when truth prevailed over prejudice, when dignity triumphed over dismissal. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that every person has worth and every voice deserves to be heard, please leave a like and subscribe so it reaches someone else who needs to hear that they matter, that they're seen, that their contributions are valuable. Share it with someone who has ever felt overlooked or underestimated. Let them know that James Reynolds' story is their story too. For more stories that celebrate the dignity of honest work and the power of standing up for truth, click the podcast link on the left. Thank you for walking this journey with us, for believing that justice matters and that every person deserves respect. Until next time, remember, you don't need a suit to have integrity, you don't need wealth to have worth, and you don't need status to make a difference. See you in the next story.